So next up we have Jeff Haas speaking about BGP security vulnerabilities and CVSS. We also have, I'm sorry, I apologize. You didn't get onto my my list here.
Perfectly okay.
We'll provide our own introduction. Thank you. So,
Please.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Program Committee, for letting us have this second slot after lunch. Hopefully, you've woken up after your food now. So I'm Jeff Haas. As previously mentioned at last presentation, I work on BGP over at Juniper for mostly BGP, BFD standards, and I get to talk to folks such as you, which is very helpful. And we have Matt, who will introduce himself.
Yeah, hi, Matt Paulson. I work at the CERT, so I issue CVEs for Juniper, and I also do a lot of multi-vendor coordination on security vulnerabilities that are more protocol, non-Juniper related issues.
So who here in the audience who runs BGP has received an issue that has knocked over their BGP session and is covered by a security announcement?
Oh, we got a couple.
Yeah, I got a few.
Yeah.
Looking at the audience here, there is at least, I'll be kind, at least one person in this room that has been responsible for originating something into BGP that has actually exercised that bug and has knocked over your network.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the talk here is about what we do about these sorts of things, and how the system that's called CVSS is actually used to score stuff, and takes organizations such as Juniper to actually issue security announcements, and what happens when that occurs. And the goal here is a little bit of education, what happens as part of this process, and also as part of explaining how this process actually happens. It sort of slams the door shut on information you might want to use to protect your network and why we do that. So Matt, why don't you take this one?
Sure, CVSS. It's a system that was put in place so then we can measure the severity of issues. So when we look at bugs, we just try to decide how severe is that issue. It's not a risk management system by itself. It's an input towards one. And so we generally try to assign some sort of a color coding to it: low, medium, high severity, critical. The ones that we at Juniper typically work on are mediums, highs, and criticals, just by the nature of CVSS itself when it comes to BGP and other protocols.
Yeah, one of the sort of perverse things about CVSS is, if you're aware of it as a general thing, you're mostly aware of it as something that pops up along with the security advisory. So there's this perverse exposure that you get that the only time you ever see it is when things are scary. And the answer is because you're only being told about it as part of announcements. If you're following other security escapes, we're scoring the bugs that we have internally, but we don't necessarily have to report them as a security issue unless they cross the threshold. What this talk is about is that for BGP, that's an incredibly low threshold for us to get to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so pretty much severity and risk, they're not the same thing. We do see that people use the severity rating as a risk input. That's not really in your best interest either. It's a good starting point, but there are other technologies, other protocols, other suites of scoring systems that can be used as well on top of CVSS to give you more of a better viewpoint of your risk management. And risk is very situational. When I'm scoring something for you folks out there, I don't know your infrastructure, I don't know your services, I don't know what operating systems you're running, what versions you're running, how you're configured. And I see that people are taking severity and using it as risk. Probably not the right thing to do.
Yeah, and as he's saying, risk is very situational. Unlike Matt, I actually get to see some of your networks and how things blow up. And the best I can do once we lock the door is say, based on what we know about your network, how scary actually is this? And the system that we have is a little bit perverse in the older version, making it look scary up front without providing any help. Mm-hmm. The newer system is a little bit better, and we'll get to that.
Mm-hmm. So the other thing that I see is that CVSS has a number of different input factors. We issue what we call base scores. There's also temporal and environmental, and depending on the version of CVSS, there's different other things like threat metricing and vendor severity ratings. But the current one that's pretty predominant right now, it's in version 3.1 specifically. And it doesn't include a vendor awareness level, and it doesn't include a threat assessment inside of it. The 4.0 specification that came out that we are using, and we're on the board for it, we're on the chair, and so we do participate in the committee. It does include those things, but even though it includes them, vendors like us, we may or may not leverage those, and sometimes we actually expect that other people will use them. It's more like threat management organizations that you might be working with, or your partners, or even yourself, your InfoSec teams. So when it comes to as far as us issuing it, whenever we get a severity level that's high enough, we send it out. And so we have to make some sort of a determination about whether or not to notify you. And our advisories and our CVEs themselves, they're kind of separate. All the information that we know about is that we can share with you, it is going to be in our security advisory. Not necessarily all the information in the CVE itself is going to be there. So the source of truth isn't always the CVE. We have additional information that we add to the advisory. We have to follow a very specific set of standards just for the CVE.
Yep, and that highlighted sentence is the important one for those of you in the room. We can't tell you more about the details where we think telling you or telling anybody else can actually help, cause the problem.
Right.
BGP is special among this stuff. The program committee correctly observed that this system seems to be very strong for pretty much anything as a routing protocol, and that's absolutely true. But you usually don't have people worrying about IGP attacks because they're from inside the house and you can actually do something about it. BGP is coming from far away a lot of times. Is this a problem from a direct peer? Is this coming from halfway around the internet? And the fact that BGP can circulate these bugs across the internet is actually the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we'd like you to extend the stores. And as I mentioned, we do issue our security advisories at 5. It's very easy, almost impossible not to be a 5 or higher when it comes to a protocol, a network protocol. Just by the nature of how CVSS scores are scored, it's going to hit a 5 or higher. The vast majority of them are going to be at least a 5.3 or a 7.5 under the CVSS 3.1 spec. And we're mandated to send them out. So we fix it in all the releases, we send out the advisory, but what I see again is people taking that severity and turning it into risk, and it's not necessarily the case. Just because we're sending it out doesn't mean you're more or less risk affected.
No, and so this slide is issued by Matt's organization, but this is what programmers such as myself at Juniper see, and this applies generally to everybody across the industry. This is part of responsible disclosure. Mm-hmm. Part of what this means as a person who works on the protocols, might actually talks to people in the field, gives presentations at conferences, knowing something bad can happen. I can't give details because that is a disclosure of the internal stuff, and it can have negative impacts. Mm-hmm. So as much as you beg and plead about some of these things, we just simply can't go there. And Juniper takes it very seriously, as does other vendors.
Mm-hmm. And we work really closely with other certs and other teams. We do a lot of multi-vendor coordination. When we find out about something, we reach out and start talking to other people. There's multiple different avenues that I have to do that. From small one-on-one contacts that we have to large-scale coordination.
Yeah, and this is it's more of a Matt slide than me, but the fundamental behavior that we run into once we hit network protocols, mm-hmm. If I see something that looks suspicious, it's going to get flagged. It goes off to Matt's organization, and we start going through the evaluation process. And we have 2 different mechanisms: 3.1, which is the older one, and 4.0 that came out, mm-hmm. And pretty much for BGP. We're looking at impacts on availability. Something that pops out for some reason, knocks over your direct peering session because it's from right next to you, or it trickles around the entire internet. Like I said, there's at least one person in this room that sent out something that has knocked over portions of the internet, not necessarily on purpose, but based on an issue that occurred.
People just have good ideas, and sometimes they decide to implement them, and then they go, oh, look at that, it was unusual, and it crashed something. And then I get an email. It's pretty simple. If an attacker, we call them an attacker, it doesn't matter if you're a good or bad guy, right? Attacker doesn't have any authentication, it's a network-based level that can cross more than one hop. It's unauthenticated, i.e. I send packet. If it makes the box fall over, that's high impact. So you're into a security advisory.
Yeah, and the difference is it doesn't matter if it's knocking over the box's peering session or it actually causes a crash. The impact is on availability, but obviously the blast radius can matter depending on the bug.
Yeah.
And They like to talk about attack complexity, in terms of what they tend to look for across the organization. For us, it's, this is BGPs being used. Is something able to be just simply tossed to the internet and get to you somehow? So, this is not hard. And it's very easy for BGP as a protocol based on, optional transitive nonsense to just simply leak from one place to the other and cause doom.
And you're probably already doing all of the really good things that you should be doing anyways. You've got authentication, you're restricting. But in our world, we have to say what is the most probable use case as well, and it's the unauthenticated open person. And that's why a lot of these scores also get elevated up. And that's why it's important you take these scores and you rescore them for yourselves, because the severity level for you is probably going to drop. I can't do that for you. You have to do it for yourself. I'm not allowed to.
Yeah, and the trust model for the internet, from day one has been transitive. And as we've heard across the presentations the last couple of days, RPKI is out there to try to help us, provide, more certitude about trust of what we should trust about the data. We have other systems that are attempting to lock things down and make sure that they're secure. But the problem is, once it's coming from far away, your trust level starts to get a little fragile. And thankfully, the vast majority of bugs impacting BGP is not an attack on what's normally called integrity. That's the usual stack smash type thing that you see out of most of the applications. Routing implementations, in general, I certainly can't speak for everybody, tend to be something that's walking across data that's been allocated on a heap. It's not actually sticking stuff into the stack. And as a side effect, a significant portion of what's being done just simply doesn't have a chance to cause this flavor of crash.
And within the 3.1 and 4.0 world, there was a big change, in my viewpoint. Modification of data became trustworthiness and veracity of information. And so when I start scoring my 3.1 scores, they're probably not going to look exactly the same in a 4.0 world if you see both my scores side by side. And it's because of how they changed it. And the 4.0 scores are more closely tuned to what we want to try to express to you as urgent and important. Against how 3.1 was kind of layering everything across the same, because it's you can have a widespreading BGP issue, but I can express that urgency to you in 3.1, or you could have a non-concerning, well, it's another bug, but some bad person could do this, but the odds are really, really low. I can't tell you that it's necessarily a green issue in my mind. I can't reach out to you and explain that. 4.0 lets me work on that a little bit better.
Yeah, and the reason to explain all these terms is this is a tool that you can run yourself and see how easy these things are to tickle. And realistically, this should be a conversation you're having with all your vendors and all of your open source that you consume. There's risk here, and the system's fair. But a consequence of the system being fair is that with these inputs and way BGP in particular operates, it's very easy for us to tickle at least a 5.3. And 7.5s for stuff that causes crashes or boxes to fall over. 7.5 is the most common thing we're going to see for most of what looks like a vulnerability, even if it's just a software bug.
And it's, if I pull up a chart, and I showed it to Jeff during a chat one day, and I said, I bet you 7.5 is going to be the top in the last quarter. I pulled it up, it was the top. A quarter of the 7.5s were his. So it's pretty easy to hit a 7.5. It's pretty easy. And it doesn't matter if it's availability, confidentiality, integrity, it's going to be a 7.5. It scores the same.
Yeah, the consequence here is, as a software developer and as somebody that's actually working on standards and somebody that's working with operators, the question becomes, when is a bug just a bug or it's a security issue? And, one of the sort of interesting joke scenarios is, if there's a network protocol that you can, do a thing on top of that will knock your box over, that's going to be a 7.5. If that bug happens to be you've SSH'd into your CLI and typed a thing that crashes the box, and you shouldn't do that, and you'd really want to actually know about these things. But the trouble is, if that sort of severity, this is the impact on the system, is something that could be caused from far away, well, the questions start getting a little bit vague. It is just a bug, but the bug is something that somebody else might be exercising. And my own criteria for this sort of thing is, can I cause bad things by sending a packet? And Derek over at Juniper, he actually terms this in terms of disclosure. This is part of the philosophy that causes us to lock our doors for these things because they're important. If the attacker does know the details, could they make the bad thing happen on purpose? So we have this interesting tug of war. It's like, Matt's group, gets consulted, is there to tell us how bad things can look from an arbitrary system that can be used impartially, but has not enough signal in it in terms of how bad it can be, because that situational thing we talked about, how BGP can be used, because BGP gets used internet, obviously. Used for VPNs, used for things like FlowSpec. They're all different use cases on the same type of protocol, and the same thing is true of other protocols as well. The question is, what's the blast radius of these things? And for a lot of other protocols, the blast radius is maybe the LAN segment inside your network, but for BGP, it can take down the planet itself.
Right.
So the trick becomes, what are you talking about? Is this a local thing? Is this something that my peer next door can do? Or is this something that actually comes around the planet, and that vulnerability is what we care about?
And is it E or I? Is it 4 or 6? Is it all of them? Is it just a couple of them? I can't explain within the CVE sometimes what that blast radius looks like. It may provide too much information. Other times I can. And so when you're trying to do that assessment and you're just looking at that score, all of those are 7.5s.
Yep.
But if it's just I, it's probably not as risky for you, and that's why it's a severity thing. It's not risk, it's severity.
Yeah, and this talk came out of a dialogue, from Matt and I talking about these things over the last 5 years.
Yeah.
And the tug of war is, I want to tell you, what's going to protect your network against the given bug,
and I need a better standard.
And we actually need to make sure that we don't send out things that can crash the internet as a whole, give people bad tools. So part of the interesting headache here is, given that BGP score is so high, well, the question is, why aren't more things called vulnerability?
There should be more.
Yeah, this is the interesting headache. So when you see that there's a lot of BGP security vulnerabilities, and some of you have been negatively impacted by things that are covered by a vulnerability, one of the other things maybe take a look at is your other vendors' databases. This is not to put any vendor under a bad light. This is to highlight that the process is intended to be fair and make you ask questions. So some of the reasons is maybe the so-called maturity of the organization is a different spot inside of a software lifecycle.
And there could be organizations that don't necessarily have their own certs propped up yet, or they have them, but they're not working in the way that they would be working within the CVE community, the way we'd like them to work, or they're restricted by their own internal mechanisms. They have market forces that they're pushing against, or they're just not aware of how to prop them up. And then other organizations are willing. They come in, they say, okay, teach us how to do this. And we spend a lot of time, and Derek in particular spends a lot of time bringing up new CNAs within the CVE organization and showing them how to build it. And when we find that those organizations start moving along that path, suddenly they're not issuing CVEs because somebody's threatening them, or they're not issuing CVEs because they're only doing it because they can get some revenue because they were locked out of a deal. And we see that. And then as they start maturing, instead of issuing 1 CVE or 2 CVEs in a quarter, suddenly they're doing 10 or 15. But they're still not at the level of maturity that we're seeing large organizations like ours and a couple other vendors that have been doing it from pretty much day one, and where we continue to enhance our own processes. And as I see organizations moving in that direction, I see a natural increase in the number of CVE counts. And it's still an evolution. It still grows. We would like to issue more. It's just there's momentum to getting to that upper number.
Yep, and especially when we're dealing with open source. We had earlier a presentation that involved pulling a bit of open source BGP, running some of the experiments on that. That vendor, where are they at in terms of disclosure? Where are they in terms of the bug fix processes? In deep fairness to every single one of the big open source projects, they're very good about taking bug reports and ideally fixing them as soon as possible. And people making use of open source in an agile fashion are capable of pulling in the fixes, in many cases at a faster rate than a vendor that has a waterfall distribution model tied to shipping hardware.
Right.
So they have the possibility of doing better, but they don't frame the risk in the same way, and they don't score the severity in a similar fashion. So this is one of those things of, as you're consuming products from different vendors or even open source, keep in mind that just because you see something that says, there's a vulnerability against this, doesn't necessarily mean that this thing is necessarily itself, worse. ask yourself when you see stuff, from the customers, that are using these things, or you're internally using themselves, where is the risk being exposed in the process? This one's totally me because, living at the opposite end in DevLand.
It's you.
Yeah, it's like, we have this interesting headache, in terms of taking our software developers and getting them to actually use this process. There's a huge set of disincentives, and the biggest one for somebody like me that deals with the outside world, or our sales teams, or our resident engineers that are working closely with customers, they don't want the wall of silence that pops up when we create an advisory. We stop talking about the details, and that freaks you out. And that's part of what we're trying to help here a little bit, is understanding a little bit of the why. And as part of this, we're also applying pushback across the security organizations and industry that are creating these systems to take the tooling and try to actually help expose the risk and urgency in a better fashion. The second headache that we have is that even if we tell you that there's something bad out there, network upgrades are a pain in the ass. They're expensive. If you're getting back-to-back security issues, when do you push the trigger and actually do the upgrade? And this is hard to do when we don't tell you enough stuff.
Well, and there's something a little perverse about BGP itself. People ask me the same question over and over, what's the workaround? And the funny part is most of the time, overwhelmingly most of the time, there is no workaround. There really isn't, okay? Stop asking, please. There's no workaround. The only workaround is upgrading. It's the nature of BGP itself. And so when I'm going through a vulnerability, I'm talking to some folks on our signature team. Can we write a signature? No, we can't. I've even published a blog post about it, how we need a whole new technology, a classic technology to address that. It doesn't exist. There's no market momentum for a brand new version 4 firewall that can even do this. And the second part of it is just the way it's designed.
Yep.
You can't filter it. You cannot work around these issues. Yeah, the only option is to upgrade. And in many cases, I sit back with Jeff and I said, okay, what are you going to do in RFC land to fix it? Because that's where this started.
Right. This hits our conversation yesterday. How do we fix this tonight? Final point for this slide is that there's revenue impact by being honest. And this is one of the reasons why you don't sometimes see this from other organizations. Looking a little more inward and towards the software teams, if you actually are working with anything security, teaching a software developer that is barely familiar with protocols and maybe not necessarily any exposure to network operations, to think in a security context is tricky. So security mindset is a challenging thing to
We
to
spend
learn.
a lot of time here.
Yeah, and analyzing bugs after the fact, is like you get a bug in there, we fix the bug, well, this is obviously a thing. When do you take a look at it and say, well, was this just a bug or is it a vulnerability?
And then not everybody likes CVE. I've even had somebody here just yesterday tell me they just wish that they would just tear it down, and then what we can do is we can focus on the real problem, which is shifting security to the left in software. I don't necessarily disagree with that either. Feel free to put me out of a job. I'd rather go do something fun. And also for CVSS, because revenue gets impacted, I don't want to pay for it. But then of course the perverse side of that is you're not going to get the purchase order unless you do. So my counter argument is feel free to get engaged because you'll probably make more sales with the government. Many only issues for CVE threatened with disclosure. We see that as kind of a 2-point. People want to get the CVE because they want to pad it onto their resume. That's fine. I'm happy to support you, but we also have a first come, first serve, right? We're kind of honorably entitled to say the person that found the issue first should get their name on the CVE, but not everybody likes that. Some people want to get a CVE and a name for themselves the second or third time down the road just because it wasn't disclosed. Low CV counts. Yeah, I see vendors try to use low CV counts as a marketing reason for saying they're better. I can tell you, I've been asked many times to do my own internal assessments. I have performed them. I didn't always work at Juniper either. I've been working for security companies or in security companies, software companies and hardware companies for the vast majority of my career. Everybody's the same. I've never seen anybody be better than anybody else. I have seen people be worse intentionally because they're not doing things. But when the companies are all doing the same things, everybody's the same. And then now we have some new standards. Some of these are newer than others. Some of them have more adoption than others. We have CVSS, which also combines with EPSS, with VISS. I really enjoy VISS. If you haven't seen it, please look at it. It's for you guys, not for me. I can't use it. You can. I beg you, please use it. EPSS is really interesting. It looks at threat mapping as a vulnerability comes out. You'll notice that a lot of the CVEs that get issued have an EPSS well below 10%, many of them below 1%, and that's because there's no threat. There's no indication of threat. But once it pops, once it hits into the real world, what you'll find is that CVSS complying with that EPSS suddenly shoots through the roof. So pay attention to that.
Yep.
And SBOM and SBOM-VEX.
Yep. So there's more tools in the toolbox, and again, part of the purpose of the work that we're doing together is talking outward to the community that actually is the victim of these things, and also trying to actually work inward towards the security organizations that provide a better tool set to help you understand what's the difference between risk. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I've gotten the crash course through CVSS, courtesy these guys over the last several years. 4.0 took some of the inputs from our conversations, and there's now some level of sense of urgency built into the protocol. The scary numbers go down in some circumstances situationally, but for the most part, it's still the same sort of thing. This is a assessment of severity, but the granularity is a bit better for you guys out in networking land.
But at least we can say Jeff Scary equal red, so that's good.
Yeah.
So. Yeah.
So, and we're going to go through these things, leave a little bit of time to have some discussion, but some of these things have been improved. Feel free to look at the actual inputs across the CVSS stuff.
UNE.
And again, this is a reminder, this is about discussing severity. We need a better framework to discuss risk. We had a lovely talk on talking about the impacts of trying to get spam off your network and the negative consequences that cause somebody trying to do the right thing. This is in the same family of stuff. Same thing is true for all of these various other systems. We want to get you into them. Covering very briefly BGP. We've had it error handling RFC for a while. This is one of those things that Juniper, is an annoying thing, had it on as a knob. As of the most current release that's coming out this month, it is now on by default. So you don't have to configure error tolerance anymore. Check your other vendors in terms of where they are in their support. This has been a helpful thing in mitigating classes of these issues against the protocol.
If it's off, please turn it on.
And there's IETF work, as he's saying. What can we do about these things to make them less scary? So attribute scoping, a lot of the things that are the packets of doom are often contents that are received in an internet context that you as internet service providers don't give a damn about. Can we give you better tools to get these things out without necessarily breaking incremental deployment of new features? I have a lovely document here in the site in the slides about attribute escape that covers this. Please take a look at this as an operator and see if you have opinions about how this stuff is supposed to work. And final call, we have a couple of acknowledgements. Dave Dugall, who did CVSS, was contributed to this.
Alan over at CISA, a couple folks, Dario, Elliot over at Cisco. They've been very helpful on some of this. Yeah.
So, we understand this is a little bit on the tech side of things, but it's hopefully, removed some of the opacity on how we actually do security issues within at least Juniper and what the industry as a whole is getting. We have time, I think, hopefully, for a couple of brief questions.
2 minutes. Hi.
Anybody? Nobody?
Okay. Oh, wait a minute. We got Tony coming up.
Somebody's got to do it. So Tony Tauber from Comcast, what in your engagement in this area, have you seen or heard discussed about, well, if I decide, if an operator decides, because upgrading, the code all over the place is, a big effort. Where does that discussion end up leading, and any penalties to the extent that regulators might get involved for like scoring and all this stuff? Like, has there been any discussion of like how might an operator articulate the how they handle that situation, right?
So trying to give at least a brief answer out of BGP land, less than security land. The question you're really asking is, once something is known, is it fair enough that a provider can tell you this is scary, you have to do something about it? And as a operator, is there liability either business related or potentially regulation related? At the moment, that depends partially on your SLAs to your customer. That's the easiest business impact on things. But one of the things I'll actually point out from unfortunate experience over the last few years, these outages sometimes have national impact, and people have died as a consequence of the routing systems having issues. These things are not free from problems, and they do get scrutiny from various governments.
We see regulators or government entities getting involved infrequently. It's not unheard of, though. But typically it's about why we didn't release the advisory earlier, even though we knew about it. And it's because we need to get it fixed everywhere first. But then the second side of it is we don't see people upgrading, even though there's no workaround. As I said, a lot of these just don't have workarounds. And I think that kind of falls back on the customers to decide where the risk was for them and to make the decision not to make the upgrade. And that's a conversation normally, it's not necessarily here in the US, but mostly overseas I see it, where the service providers, the telcos themselves are government owned and operated, where that interplay occurs.
Thanks.
That's great. I think we're out of time for questions.
Brief comment.
Brief comment. Very brief comment.
For those operators, thank you for the presentation on CVSS stuff and so forth, and bringing more awareness. For those operators here that are newer into the market, younger into the market, strong encouragement to sign up to your vendors' disclosure and distribution mailing lists. Stay on top of it. Security is not a spectator sport.
Yeah, and feel free to talk to me afterwards. Yeah, there's other things I can help you guys with if you want some information. And a good place to start, if this is new to you, cvedetails.com, good site. It'll kind of link you into other stuff. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks very much.
Appreciate it.